for sort of at this stage, we're primarily talking about the site itself, but it's worth understanding the broader context that the government's priority declaration area actually includes publicly owned land to the east and to the west as well. So the current status of this site is that it's government owned. A train station is being built underground, and that train station will connect to Albert Street in the city to the north, and will connect down to Boggo Road in the south. If you can see on my screen, this recessed area here, this sort of where they've been digging quite deeply, that's essentially the area of the train station within the site. So it's sort of in the middle of the site, slightly to the western end, and that's effectively where the station itself will go, and with the underground platforms and a ground level entrance. But the rest of the site is kind of up for grabs at the moment. The government has released an interim land use plan, which guides kind of what will happen over the next little while. And that document can be found online, and we'll email out links to these documents for anyone who's interested. But this interim land use plan essentially sets out what kinds of development will be allowed over the next little while until the development scheme is released. So the government has stated that the development scheme will be finalised and publicly notified during the next 18 months. So they announced that back in April. So essentially we've got a situation where at some point over the next 18 months, the government is going to come out with a sort of robust, presumably, plan for exactly what's going to happen on this site. And presumably it's going to be quite detailed in terms of how many buildings and how many towers, et cetera, et cetera. Until that happens though, we're kind of in the dark about what's going to happen on this site. All we have to go off is what's in that interim land use plan and what's in the state government's visualizations that they've been releasing as part of their promotion and to get discussion going. So this video was released in March 2020. And this is essentially the most detail we have about what the state government's proposing. And what's often the case is that the state government will say, oh, these are just artist visualizations. We're not planning to build anything in particular, but there are obviously still decisions being made about what gets shown in the artist visualization. And you'll see in this visualization, they show a small amount of green space. They show a new pedestrian overpass connecting to the stadium, and they show a lot of high rises. So I'll just play a short little bit of it, and hopefully you can see this. But this is looking in from the looking west, coming from the east over the stadium. So you can see the visualizations tend to focus a lot on what's happening with the underground station, which I always find a little bit annoying. But jumping ahead, coming out, they haven't really given a lot of detail, but they have taken the trouble to render sort of some vague high-rise shapes. And it does appear to be their intention from this visualization that they're talking about 8 to 10 high-rises. So you can see here, they're proposing to build high-rises over the busway itself, which probably or possibly might not be feasible anyway. Large buildings usually need deep foundations. They're also proposing a building on top of Woolloongabba Place Park, which you might be able to see here. That's currently green space. They're talking about another big high-rise over here where the cricket club, etc., is, and then a few more large buildings through the middle of the site. This black building here is the train station. And then they're talking about a little bit of green space, but not a huge amount, considering that we're talking about a 5-hectare site. So that is literally all we know at the moment in terms of what the government's concrete plans are, but we can infer a little bit more. And what we can infer is that there's a plan to sell off development rights to the private sector, because that's what they've done on quite a few of the other Cross River Rail sites, such as Albert Street in the city. And that's been the rhetoric that's hidden in the interim land use plan. So when you read that interim land use plan and the priority development declaration, there's a clear intention there to sell off development rights to the private sector. And part of the reason that I'm trying to get residents interested in this site and to be advocating publicly is that the process by which the state government makes decisions for these sites is not particularly democratic or accessible and engaging for the public. So the tendency is sort of, you have this long period of build-up where the government talks in vague terms about, oh, we've got some visualizations and we'll announce a scheme soon. And then very quickly they announce a scheme. There's a very short window of public consultation, and then suddenly the decision's been made and it's all too late to change anything. And we saw that kind of pattern with the Queen's Wharf mega casino project in the city, where there was a lot of conjecture for years about what would happen. Then suddenly the casino was announced. There was a 1-month public submissions period, and then it's all go. So my hope is that by getting onto this a little bit earlier, we can start to articulate what the community wants even before the development scheme is published or the draft development scheme is published. So we're on the front foot and articulating really strongly what we think is important. So I have a lot of thoughts about the site, but today is mostly about hearing from a few other people who I think have very important views to share. And I'm really grateful that we've been joined today by Tessa Leggo and Adrian Pisarski and Amy MacMahon, who are going to be speaking about a few different aspects of the site and what they think it should include and what they think the government ought to be mindful of and how this site's developed. So I'm going to start by handing over to Tessa Leggo. Tessa is a landscape architect based in Woolloongabba who's going to talk a little bit about design and connectivity and green space. So please welcome Tessa to the screen.
Hi. So as Jonah said, I'm Tessa. I'm a practicing landscape architect. I have a particular passion for visioning of landscape and urban design in major projects. I am unashamedly biased towards working for the best outcome for public open space, but I will caveat that I'm not a planner, an engineer or an architect. So my discussion today will centralise on external spaces and the major role it has to play in delivering any vision for the community. I will flick to the share screen so I can get you some visuals. So hopefully that's hit you guys. So my office happens to be in Woolloongabba. Every day I look, use and experience this area. And that's probably what everyone here today has in common. We look, use and experience Woolloongabba. Some of you will live in the immediate area, some might work, some might just use this area as a conduit to get to other places. But we all interact with central Woolloongabba, and a project of this size and nature will undoubtedly impact on how we can interact with the precinct in future. So looking, it's our very first step in reading our landscape. It helps us to navigate to the things that we need, and what we don't see is just as influential as what we do see. So it's a major stake in our community's identity. What facilities do we have and how do we functionally use them? How easy is it to access what we want? And then everything that you come in contact influences your experience, and all the little things that build into what can be a positive, a neutral or a negative experience, which then in turn advises your future choices. And this is incredibly important when we're talking about the success of major investments. The quote, "If you build it, they will come," is sort of in equal parts true and not true. True, if you build nothing, no one will come. But if you build something that does not cater for the community, they won't come either. So the interim land use plan is just the beginning of seeing development started on this site. And there's lots of intricacies within the document that start to set out the shape of things to come. And I just wanted to draw your attention to this statement at the start of this document. So it's important to digest that this is the start and not the end, and we can all play a role in influencing what comes next. While the interim plan centres on Precinct 1, I'll talk about the entire sort of PDA, public priority development area, but focusing mainly on views, connections and public open spaces. Views can get complex, but I'm just going to pull out some major heritage and user views rather. In the interim plan, they denote that we have 2 heritage sites in Precinct 1, and it says that development has to be mindful of the views to them. But then what about this one, and this one, and so on? So any development impacts on these views as well, and the interim plan should also be addressing those. And by not doing so, it has dismissed their importance by omission. So I'll show in plan just a couple of major long view lines that I don't think should be dismissed. So the first is the view from the crest of Main Street back to the Stanley Street Heritage Row down here. Then moving into the Five Ways itself, which in itself is an extremely important heritage intersection. It's seen some major developments through the years, but particularly the Moreton Rubber building as an iconic portion of that. And then, of course, to the Gabba. And I'll just flick you through some photos to sort of show you what I mean by it. So this image is taken off Google Street View, taken in October 2019, when the GoPrint site was demolished. And you can see, you get a view from the police station to all of those heritage buildings along that row to the Chalk Hotel-ish. And so move to this week. So they've put the site offices up. And so you start to see that view line diminished, that division of that view line, that interruption, and then pop some buildings in it. And you get that. Moving through to the Five Ways, that's where we are this week. That's where we are with building, as shown on the visualization. To the Gabba, that's where we are with the building. Now, you can see that there's some, I actually think there's some thought has been placed in the positioning of this building to not obscure this sight line to the main entry. Is it enough? Is that the most important view that they've given consideration to? I don't know. So we love the area because of its character, and its heritage buildings in the Gabba are just no small part of it. So to support the character, it has to remain visible. So any development that presents a wall of buildings doesn't support the broader precinct and the community within that. So move on to connections. Now, this is from the land use plan. So in the criteria, they talk about connections, a lot about connections, but it's glaringly insular. It talks about connecting the bus to the train and to the new development and obviously to the stadium. But there's very little about connecting to the wider precinct. And this becomes apparent when we take a look at this, the only mapping in the plan that shows any kind of planning structure. So the blue dashed lines lump the existing and proposed primary pedestrian and cycle connections in together. But I just wanted to split that out to you. So now you're seeing the red lines there, that's the proposed primary connections. I would sort of ask, what are they connecting to? So you've got the bus to train to stadium, check, covered. You've got a nice big bridge over Main Street. So the criteria in the plan says that that bridge across Main Street is to act as an active transport connection outside of game day. But where are the links to the existing primary ped and cycle network? There's a little connection shown down here from the stadium to the southern side of Stanley Street. And so that's often shown as another little bridge link, which actually could work, but you have to think about who it is servicing. So the lack of clarity here means that it's starkly obvious that there's no plan for integration to the wider area. So the existing on-ground crossings will have to do, which means also that any kind of mutual precinct building so that this development supports the already existing commercial precinct is lost completely. So the old stadium master plan shows that little bridge link here. But if this was to happen, they would effectively create a bypass to the existing commercial area on Logan Road, which does not in any way facilitate economic development and development for community purposes. It's in effect robbing Peter to pay Paul. So, and also I would argue that commuter cyclists need a link to the bikeway that runs along this western edge of the highway, but that's another gap in the plan. Is there any linkage to the west side of that precinct? If they're expecting active travel users to come through here or be a source of those active travellers, where do they link into the network? So there needs to be way more strategic planning here. And it's also imperative to split out your commuter cyclists from recreational cyclists and then also pedestrians. And lots of thought around where you want these people to go. Commuter cyclists need less conflict, quick connections. Recreational cyclists and pedestrians need amenity. It's hugely important for youth. We also need slower foot traffic funneled past the businesses in the commercial precinct. But there's so much potential here to improve the project viability in relationship with Wollongabba and its Wollongabba. BCC has a Wollongabba precinct renewal strategy currently out for comment, which has more regarding connections. So some effort needs to be made by the interim plan to integrate with those plans for renewal. and both need to investigate in much greater detail the what, the where, the why, the how to make those connections actually work. How did COVID-19 isolation treat everybody? Were you able to get out and walk around the neighbourhood and maybe do your sanctioned exercise? I'd be interested to see and hear how this community got out and about, and if you came to place greater importance on your access to larger public open spaces in this time. I'm going to just use BCC's planning desires here. They have a desire set that for every 1,000 people, 0.8 hectares of urban recreational space should be available. So in 2016, BCC released some numbers around expected population growth to help determine infrastructure planning. I'm just using Woolloongabba suburb as an example, but these numbers aren't a true indication of people impacted by this development as it sits on the edge geographically. So say we just use 2031's numbers as a good middle ground for how many people we should at least cater for. You'd need 12 hectares of park for Woolloongabba suburb. As you can see by that little line around Woolloongabba, we are no way near it. The Cross River Rail plan shows a nice green space of about 0.9 hectares, which would in effect cater for about 1,000 people. Now, is that 1,000 people that already live in Woolloongabba as Woolloongabba Place Park is being removed, or is it a new 1,000 people? It's nowhere near 12 hectares, and they shouldn't have to supply that much either. But what does need to occur is having a definite understanding of what the final mix is for this development, so that you're able to determine if there's enough outdoor recreation space to cater for the proposed development. Now, purely conjecture, but say you wanted to provide the minimum necessary area for these the people, the new people that you've built in here, and to offset Woolloongabba Place Park. So this graphic, the Cross River Rail graphic, that's just a still taken off the visualization, shows 12 towers. And so just assume they have a capacity of 300 people each. That's about 3,500 people, which equates to 2.8 hectares. Then you add on Woolloongabba Place Park, which is about 0.48. So that this development should provide about 3.28 hectares of public recreational space just to deal with itself. And that's about 3/4 of the Go Print site. So I'll go on and assume that that's not what Cross River Rail was thinking to provide. But it does illustrate the importance of knowing what mix of uses you are going to have, and can you fit everything that the community will need in that space. If you work back through the numbers, the net additional space provided for in this current plan would cater for about 400 people, which might do about 2 buildings worth. Perhaps that is a better expectation of what this land can realistically yield. Or maybe there's a middle ground there somewhere, balancing the development with the open space and enabling the physical and visual connections. Of course, there's not just one type of public space. There's active, passive, natural, urbanized, playgrounds for exercise. The list can go on. What are we putting in here? What purpose does it serve? Is it going to cater for the residents or the families or the office workers or senior residents or all of the above? And how is that defined? In my perfect world, having this area's main function as a public open space in total, rather than a development site, would be of major benefit to the suburb and the residents, also to the businesses and the city as a whole. If you imagine the Go Print site as a district public park with only minor development within it, you'd have open sight lines, beautiful public space, ample room for event staging, people passage, unimpeded access to public transport. A major park like that would not only help, it would only help this area. It would support a commercial precinct that struggles with occupancy and patronage. It would service Woolloongabba residents with sorely needed recreation space, and it would anchor the already iconic precinct as a world-class destination. You know, and I'd love the authority to give that some serious consideration. But what are we asking for? My particular desire is to see a publicly funded master plan of the entire precinct that considers the local context and servicing the entire area, not just insular to the PDA area. To me, there are currently just too many unknowns. There's no way of knowing if the development any development that may be approved under this or any future land use plans can actually deliver holistically on even the criteria they have set out. A feasibility study and a master plan is an absolute must before any further designations. So the authority can clearly demonstrate that the community needs are actually able to be met. And that master plan should be delivered by a diverse group that can suitably advise on the balance. It should include people from community services, strategic property consultants, the Jaggera and Turrbal people, landscape and urban designers, infrastructure planners, stakeholder community groups, and of course, you. Basically, it's up to you. What's important to your relationship with Woolloongabba? It could be one or none of the things that I've spoken about, but something else that you want to see in the community. Remember that the Woolloongabba priority development area, again, main purpose is to facilitate economic development and development for community purposes. You are the community, and so how will they know what you want unless you tell them? So thank you very much for having me, and hopefully we'll get to continue the conversation later. Thanks. Thanks, Jono.
Oh, Tessa, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. You covered so much ground there. That was really, really good.
Swiftly.
I'm bubbling with questions right now. We'll save our questions till after we've heard from all three speakers, but I thought you made some really good points, particularly about the ratios of green space and the fact that the more housing we put on the site, the more green space we need to cater for future residents. But really, there's already a chronic shortage of green space in Woolloongabba. So, well done. I'm going to hand over now to Adrian Pisarski. And reminder, if anyone is really bursting with questions, just jot them down somewhere and we'll take questions at the end. So hold on to those thoughts. So our next speaker, Adrian, is the EO of National Shelter, which is a housing advocacy organisation. He's worn a range of hats in the past and really knows his stuff about housing, and he's going to talk about public housing, private housing, and all these other things in between that are called affordable housing but aren't always that affordable. So please welcome Adrian to the screen. Thanks, Adrian.
Thanks, Jono, and thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to contribute. I also want to begin by acknowledging the Turrbal and Jaggera people on whose land most of you are, their elders past and present. I'm currently on Cubby land, so I want to acknowledge them as well up on the Sunshine Coast. And the importance of housing in terms of First People and their control over housing and their own housing can't be undervalued in any kind of housing decisions. And it would be great to see this area include some Indigenous owned and community controlled housing. It would be a really nice thing to come out of it. I'm not a planner, I'm not a land use planner. I found Tessa's presentation really interesting from that point of view, but I probably have a couple of issues with it. And I'll just start by saying, look, I think this site, I am familiar with the site. I used to drive past it and go through it and work near it a number of years ago. I've always experienced that area as a real dead zone in Brisbane. You essentially drive around it or walk around it, but there was no kind of throughput in that area. It really seemed as an area to me blocked off from its surrounds. So I think opening it up to its surrounding area is would be a really good achievement. So I think that this allows a focus on three elements from our perspective in terms of housing. The first is good design, the second is diversity, and the third is density. So the density issue probably puts me somewhat in conflict with some of the things that Tessa was going to say, but I will note that if you've got good transport connections from there to other parts of Brisbane which are close by, you really improve the amenity of any housing or residential facility that's there. It's notwithstanding the view lines and the other points that Tessa was making, but I think opening up that area does provide the opportunity for some dense housing that should include affordable housing, and part of that should be social housing. So they're the kind of first things that I want to talk about. National Shelter's view is that wherever you've got a government land site that's being redeveloped, it should contain a significant proportion of social housing and affordable housing. At a minimum, we talk about 15% at least of any housing that's there should be affordable. And, you know, I can go into those definitions a bit more in a while. And 1/3 of that should be social housing. And by social housing, we mean either public housing, or what I'd probably prefer for that site is community housing, housing that's controlled by community housing organisations. I think that provides the best opportunity for a mixed tenure approach to developing housing in that area. And mixed tenure is really one of the things that we promote in these sorts of housing developments. I think when we've talked about social housing in the past, there's a real danger of getting over concentrations of people on low incomes with very high needs housed in the same place. That can create its own issues in a community. And there's also dangers of exclusion, that nobody gets to live there. And they're the kind of two extremes that we tend to see in developments around social housing. You either get it's all social housing and nobody else, or you get it's all private housing and there's no social housing. Both of those approaches, in our view, are wrong. There's a real opportunity in this development to put in a mixed tenure approach with affordable housing and social housing in there. Now, where it is government land, I think the proportion could go up to 30% of any residential development that's on that site that is affordable, and 1/3 of that being social housing. So they're kind of our proportions that we look to in terms of what we get out of a site like this. The site is going to have great transport connections. It's very close to health facilities. It's very close to jobs, to education, to entertainment, to all sorts of opportunities that low-income people often don't get access to. Most often people on low incomes are forced either to the fringes of our cities where they have very high transport costs and very poor access to the opportunities that inner city people, for example, experience. So this is a great opportunity to give people on lower incomes the access to those opportunities. And I've already mentioned them, but jobs and education and access to healthcare, these are the things that often people on low incomes really desire and rarely get access to. The shortage of social housing in Queensland is already very high. Nationally, we estimate that there's a need for at least 500,000 more social housing properties than the ones that we currently have. That would effectively double what we've got, if not more, in terms of social housing in Australia. Queensland's proportion of that is about 1/5. So as a rough estimate, or as a rough guide, you could say that Queensland needs at least 100,000 more social housing properties than the ones it's got. The results of that are forcing people into the private rental market, which is a pretty hostile place. Whilst there's been some recent relief in terms of COVID actions, the partial moratoriums on evictions and the ability to negotiate lower rents and things like that, are really facing a cliff in the very near future, whereby we're going to see all of the income support arrangements that have been put in place drop off a cliff at the same time as the moratorium eviction ends. So the potential for large-scale evictions at that point is really high. The way you solve that is to build more affordable and social housing, to give people options. So I just want to reiterate, this site has the potential to do that. And it should go back to those principles of good design, diversity, and density. We don't want monolithic constructions of monocultural people living in a place which is pretty sterile. We actually want a good social mix, a good cultural mix. We want to see Indigenous people living in there. We want to see a multicultural community living in there. Might stop you getting arrested, Jono. So our aim is really to get the scale right, and that requires good master planning. I really agree with Tessa about the point of having an overall master plan for that whole site. Take advantage of the transport and the health proximities. Take advantage of those proximities to entertainment. So in terms of the affordable housing component, when we talk about affordable housing, we're generally talking about a sub-market type of housing, which isn't quite at the same level of social housing. social housing is generally people on very low incomes paying 25% of their income to access their housing, because it's about what they can afford and retain enough income to meet their other needs. Affordable housing is a little bit different to that. It's generally at a discount to the market and shouldn't probably be more than 30% of anybody's income, and should be at least 20%, if not higher, below what the market is offering. And we're talking largely around rental housing here rather than home ownership. Although you could also have home ownership in a site like this using shared equity type products that give people a proportion of that equity, so that as that equity grows, they actually have more opportunities to build wealth and increase the options about what they do with their own lives. So getting good master planning across that could accommodate those sorts of things. But to do that, if you're going to have good affordable housing developments in there, you've got to work out how it can be family friendly, how it can maximise energy efficiency, how it can maximise the disability accessibility that goes into those developments. I would agree with the points that I know you're going to make and that I've read around lower car parking requirements. There's a very low car parking requirement for that site, given its transport hub status and its transit-oriented development status. It doesn't need a high level of car parks, and that's one way you can get more affordable housing into a site like that, by having lower car parking. But it is also the opportunity to have density. I think we too often get into a battle of density in Australia where we are scared of density. But I think with good master planning and design, you can have both density and good amenity. Now, looking at the plans that you've shown and that Tessa was showing, maybe what that indicates is too much density. But I think we do need to be able to consider the role that density can play in there. And all of that needs to be located by good common use spaces for that local community and for any residents that are there. And by that, I mean, we could have smaller units of housing, for example, if there was good common use spaces. So business centres, so that people can actually work from home or work from a location without necessarily going too far. I think working from home is going to be something that is much more popular going forward, and might even mean that we need to have a look at redesigning some of the CBDs and getting better housing usage out of our CBDs as well. But I also mean libraries and meeting spaces, entertainment spaces, places where people can play. One of the problems that we've often had with dense developments in Australia is that they are not family friendly. They are stacked up little boxes of units for foreign students or small household units. And I think we need to make these places much more family friendly. That's another aspect of diversity that we often forget about in inner cities. And families, I think, should have access to inner cities as much as anybody else. So I would include that. The current plans include residential, but there's very little detail about what that consists of and who it's for, whether it's all going to be sold off to the highest bidder, we're going to have penthouses, or, you know, there's very little detail in the documents that I've seen from the government. So again, I think we need to insist on government setting targets for affordable and social housing as we go forward in the design process. And if they do set targets, then they can start to engage community housing organisations and the planners and the designers that work with them and the residents who are ultimately going to live in those places about what that design looks like. That's a really important principle that we often forget in every residential development in Australia. We very rarely talk to the end users before we start the design process. So that's got to be a really important part of this as well. The affordable components wouldn't only be about people on welfare, for example. I think we've got to start catering for workers who are not necessarily on very high incomes. And here I'm talking hospitality, retail, all sorts of working people who don't necessarily get high incomes, but who need good proximity to the areas in which they work. They shouldn't have to commute an hour or two to get to a job. And when you think about the types of work that people increasingly do in those industries, it's gig work. It's not, you know, 9 to 5, you go somewhere, you go home. They might often have to juggle 3 or 4 jobs in 3 or 4 different locations. If those locations mean travelling to every one, then their opportunities are limited. But more importantly, as an argument, the productivity of those people and the productivity of their workplaces and the economy overall is also limited. There are strong economic arguments about affordable housing adding to productivity and being considered as infrastructure. And this is probably the point that I'm going to finish on, Jono, and I'll leave the rest to discussion. But I think we've got to think about social and affordable housing not as something of an afterthought, but something that is infrastructure in itself. We have forgotten that housing is infrastructure. We don't treat it as economic infrastructure. We treat all the pipes and roads and rail and electricity that goes to the household as infrastructure, but not the housing itself. So I think reconceptualising housing, and particularly affordable housing, as essential economic and social infrastructure is something that we could be doing on this site as well. So I might leave it there and leave the rest to discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Well done, and thanks for such a valuable contribution. Again, a lot there. I'm sure people will have questions that they're bursting to have answered, but let's move on to our next speaker for now. Our final panel member is Amy MacMahon. She's a Wollongabba resident. I don't know how many years you've lived in the neighbourhood, Amy. You can tell people that. And Amy is also the Greens candidate for South Brisbane in the coming state election. And she's going to talk about a little bit about the politics of this site and about a whole lot of stuff in terms of how we fund infrastructure and public services. So I'll hand it over to Amy. Thanks, Amy.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks so much to Tessa and Adrian for setting out some really exciting visions for what we could have on this site. We have this really unprecedented opportunity with this bit of land. It's really unusual to have this size section of land in the city. That's really up to us to decide what it will look like, and we have this incredible opportunity to be putting in place a legacy for the community for years to come. And I think it's really up to the community now to start to put forward some ideas for what we could have on this site, for what we need, for what we'd like to see in our neighbourhood, particularly in a growing neighbourhood. So we do have this really exciting opportunity, but at the same time, we're up against a sort of a planning scheme that's quite hostile to community engagement. And I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail around what a priority development area is and what that means. You've all seen the visualisations of the site that have been put forward for us now. And as Jono mentioned, it's really important that we start to articulate what we as a community would like on that site now, and pushing for that, even if the development isn't starting for a few years, because the government will be starting to lay the groundwork for what they want on this site. And I think the visualisations that we've seen give us a pretty good indication of what they're planning. So I'll talk a little bit about our priority development areas, and then talk a little bit about some of the alternative visions for the site that Tessa and Adrian have so well articulated already. So I wanted to talk a bit about priority development areas because this is a little bit different to how planning is usually dealt with in Brisbane City. And it gives us some clues as to how us as a community should be organising and mobilising to get our vision forward. And also because priority development areas, to my mind, are quite alarming. They allow the government to concentrate a huge amount of power in terms of decision making, in terms of planning on priority development areas. And they allow the government to push through development very quickly. And as Jono mentioned, often once the community realises what has gone on, it's too late. So I think it's something for the community to think about in a bit more detail and be quite critical of. From the Department of State Development, priority development areas are parcels of land within Queensland identified for development to deliver significant benefits to the community. Now, benefits to the community is quite contested, particularly for some of the priority development areas we're already seeing pop up around Queensland. And so these sites, as opposed to regular development, which falls under the Sustainable Planning Act, this falls under the Economic Development Act, and it becomes the responsibility of the Economic Development Queensland. And the reason that governments like to put these sites in place is because they allow for an expedited approval process. I'll see if I can just share a picture in the chat, just so you can see this is from a little fact sheet. You should be able to see that. It's an expedited approval process. A priority development area overrides any local government planning scheme, so any existing local regulation around what the City Council and what the community would like on a site. It doesn't require for development applications to be referred to other state agencies, and importantly, there's no right for third-party appeals, so there's no opportunity for the community to be appealing decisions that are made within a priority development area. Opportunities for community input are also quite limited. Tessa and John have also already mentioned the interim land use plan. And the next thing that the government will be developing is a development scheme. And the development scheme at the moment will be out sometime early next year. And at that point, that will go out for community consultation for something like a minimum of 30 days. And it's usually a pretty short period of time. And that development scheme will outline things like the design requirements for the area, structural elements, overall vision for what the government would like to see, and the procedure for approving things on the site. So I just thought, just to give you all some idea of what this document looks like, I'll share the development scheme for the Queen's Wharf Casino. You can have a look now, or you can have a look later. But essentially, this sets out some very broad parameters for design and a bit of a vision. But if you look at this document, there's nothing in there that indicates that there is going to be a development of the scale of Queen's Wharf that we've ended up with. If you look at this document and you think, oh, there's going to be a few hotels, there's going to be some mixed-use development and so on, but there's nothing in there to indicate something quite like Queen's Wharf. And so I think we need to be really mindful as the government are putting together their development scheme for this site, that we could end up with something that we really don't want. And by the time that any development applications are being assessed, it'll be too late, because they'll already be locked in within this broader scheme. The other interesting thing with the development scheme is that they give themselves loopholes to get around the requirements that they've set out in their own scheme. So if you have a look on page 7 of this Queen's Wharf document, it basically says if something doesn't comply with one of the aspects of the land use plan, it's still allowed if it fits within the broader vision or there's sufficient grounds to justify approval. So you can see how this is sort of like a hyper version of what happens with our neighbourhood plans. So those of you who've been involved in community organisations who've been pushing back around development will know that there's a lot of developments that have been approved that contravene the neighbourhood plan. In terms of height and width and so on. So even here, with this special regulation that the government writes, they can get around their own regulation if they argue that it meets the broader vision of what we want for this site. And there's some clues in the interim land use plan that is already out, which is sort of the precursor to the development plan. Priority development area, sorry everyone. PDA stands for priority development area, which is just the government name for what these areas are. And essentially given the limited opportunities for communities to have a say in what goes on in priority development area, the community will be locked out. And we've seen this time and time again with developments that have been happening all over the neighbourhood. This is sort of like West Village times 5 in terms of what the government is already planning. And to give you some indication of what happens in other priority development areas, so I've mentioned Queen's Wharf Casino. Another priority development area you might have heard of is the Toondah Harbour development that's happening out at Cleveland. This is a section of World Heritage listed wetland, and under a priority development area, they've been approved to build something like 3,000 apartments on the wetlands. There's also the Ripley Valley priority development area where the Deebing Creek development has been approved. Some of you might be following the case with the First Nations community out there who are pushing back against a large housing development that's been approved on the site of a sacred and historical mission site out there, and that's part of a priority development area, so there's no opportunities for third-party appeal. And then all the most of the Cross River Rail sites, stations, are also priority development areas, so Roma Street, Albert Street, and the Woolloongabba station as well. So as I mentioned, the development scheme will be coming out early next year, but I think we have this opportunity now to be setting out our vision for what we'd really like for this site. I think it's also good to remember that the broader area within which this site is in is already seeing a huge amount of development. The surrounding area is zoned for mixed use and high density, so buildings between 8 and 20 stories surrounding the site. The local schools are already at capacity. The East Brisbane State School that's on just the other side of the Gabba Stadium is reaching capacity. Brisbane State High School down the road, many of you would know, is reaching capacity. Obviously the Cross River Rail is going to alleviate some public transport issues, but there's still issues around active transport to get around the neighbourhood. Tessa outlined the lack of green space in the neighbourhood, a really chronic lack of green space in Woolloongabba. And this is already a squeezed neighbourhood. So imagine if we have all these new people moving into the area, how are we going to be thinking about the kinds of infrastructure that we need to welcome new people here? So as I mentioned, we have this really unprecedented opportunity to be crafting something really exciting and valuable for the community. We have this 5.5 hectare space right in the middle of inner city land. It's publicly owned, and at this stage it seems like it's going to be transferred over to property developers to make private profit in an expedited and secretive process through a priority development area approval. And I think there's an opportunity here for the community to be asking the question, do we want to see a series of tall towers that will be, you know, a private housing being leased out on the private market, approved with minimal community income, or can we use this window of time to be pushing for a vision that we'd really like for the site? One of the things I've been thinking about, which kind of links to what Tessa was talking about, was the opportunity for a beautiful public park. If we just had one big public park right in the middle of Woolloongabba, just imagine what this would mean for the neighbouring area and for all the new developments that are going to be built in the area over the coming decade. You know, you could have a stage, you could have seating, a community hall, space for community art. You exit the station and you walk through this beautiful public park. That's one option, sort of on the far end of the spectrum. Then moving into the middle, could we be thinking about how we could be integrating affordable housing, public housing and community housing onto this site, as Adrian mentioned. The government have proposed at this stage some kind of affordable housing scheme where the government basically subsidises rent for private landlords. But I think we really need to be pushing for a public and community housing model, as Adrian mentioned, and be thinking about about, you know, how can we be integrating housing with the kind of community facilities that people need? Could we include a bulk billing GP? Could we have a childcare centre there as well? Could we have a community hall, community gardens, local shops? The Greens have been talking about our public housing policy, which plans to build 100,000 homes over the next 4 years, and funded by making sure that banks and mining corporations are paying their fair share. We know we've got a huge number of people who are waiting for social housing at the moment, nearly 40,000 people. And as some of the speakers have already mentioned, with the coming economic crisis, we're likely to be seeing more and more people who will be looking for housing, looking for affordable housing over the coming years. So I think there's an incredible opportunity here with a huge section of public land right in the middle of our neighbourhood to be thinking about how we can be integrating public and social housing into the middle of our neighbourhood. And as Adrian mentioned, thinking about housing as infrastructure, building public housing, building a large portion of public housing would eventually be able to generate revenue for the government that they could be investing in other social services, in other community facilities, and other things that the neighbourhood might need in 10 or 20 years. As well. And I think if we want something like a target for the proportion of affordable housing that we'd like on the site, and as has been mentioned, I think that's going to be up to us to push for. And I think that'd be a really valuable outcome for the site if we were to say, we want this portion of this site to be allocated to affordable housing, we want to have access to a parkland, and not just be giving it over to property developers who will be making huge towers and making huge amounts of rent for decades to come. But I'd be really keen to hear your thoughts in the Q&A and when we move to the breakout session as well, to be thinking about how we as a community could be putting forward some ideas. It's an election year this year, the election's in October. So we have an opportunity to be pushing for some good outcomes. We saw at the last state election with you know, very concerted pressure from the community and pressure from the Greens as well. The neighbourhood is now getting a number of new pieces of infrastructure. So we have this opportunity now to be pushing to get some really good outcomes on this site and to be getting something really exciting that the community will be able to be relying on for decades to come. So thank you very much. I'll hand back over to Jono to facilitate the Q&A.
Thanks, Amy. Well done. Thanks for covering so much ground. Just to reinforce that core point that Amy was making, which is that this is a publicly owned site. And often I think we get into this headspace of accepting sort of neoliberal parameters of debate where we say, well, most of the site will have to be privately owned because that's just how it's done at the moment. But as a community and as residents, there's no reason that we can't demand something better. And obviously the government will still compromise a little bit, but our job is to set broad aspirations and what we consider best practice. And for me, one of the things that's often on my mind is that public housing doesn't just have to be for low income people. There are successful models all around the world of public housing that is also for middle class and wealthier residents. And what some governments actually do is build public housing that's for a broad range of demographics, and rent from the wealthier residents ends up cross-subsidising rent and public services from lower income residents. So in a way, the government really has a choice with housing on this site. Either we just build public housing for low income people and then let the private sector reap the profits of the privatised aspect of the housing. Or we could also retain ownership of the housing that's targeted at higher income residents and say to those office workers and urban professionals, yeah, you can rent here too, and the rent will still be cheaper than market rent, but we're going to take that revenue and put that back into the public purse. So there's probably a case to be made that maybe the whole site, all the housing on the site can remain government owned and can remain non-profit in one form or another, while still having a diverse range of incomes and communities and household types. But I don't want to talk too much longer. I just did want to show one more little screenshot, which is, this is an aerial of the Brisbane City Council neighbourhood plan, or the city plan. And as you can see, the whole middle site here has been designated as a priority development area. I won't explain it in too much detail, but essentially all this orange and dark red that you can see to the north of Vulture Street, all that dark red and all that orange, and then all the orange and dark red to the south of Stanley Street, that's all what high density zoning of one form or another. So we've got a bit of heritage, like blue stuff there is, it's district centre, but most of that is heritage listed and probably won't be developed. But everything behind and a lot of the surrounding properties are already zoned for very high density, up to sort of 20 stories in many cases. And so when we think about what happens on this particular site, we need to be thinking about the context of the surrounding neighbourhood. And Adrian is 100% right that density is really important in inner city areas. It's generally speaking much better to have high density populations close to public transport. And here we've got a train station and the busway. But what's crucial to understand is that this site is also surrounded by high density and that there's a really chronic shortage of public green space. So as we go forward and we think about what our visions for this site are, let's not just think about the site in isolation, but think about the transport connectivity, think about the green space needs, and think about what else is happening around the site and in the surrounding suburb. So what we're going to do now is have a quick break because it's a bit exhausting staring at your screen for such a long time. And during this quick break, it'll only be about a minute. Just have a think about what questions you want to ask, and then we'll encourage people to post their questions in the chat group. If you can't find the chat group or you don't like typing, just turn your video on, put your hand up and you can ask the question. But it'll be easy to keep track of all the questions if people post questions in the chat. But let's just have a 1 minute break, stand up, stretch, give your eyes a rest, and then we'll be back for Q&A and think about what questions you're going to ask. Thanks. Hello to all the latecomers, by the way. I saw a few people joined us halfway through the session. Sorry you missed the start, but we will have a video recording of the whole session that we'll put up online at some point soon. We'll give people a few minutes just to stretch and get a glass of water. All right, it seems like the people who have their videos on are all back at least. So people can hear okay, I hope. Cool. Let's get into it. I see a couple of questions coming in. And I guess the other thing I just wanted to touch on, I know is inevitably one of the questions is going to be, who are the key decision makers on this site? And so the current minister overseeing Cross River Rail is Kate Jones. So she's a state MP just in the western suburbs. So she's the minister of, I can't remember the exact title, it's sort of development and infrastructure, minister for state planning. So Kate Jones oversees the Cross River Rail project directly. But another key decision maker is Mick de Brenny. He's the housing minister and he's also the minister for sport. And this project is being conceptualised in large part due to its proximity to the Gabba Stadium, and a lot of that design outcomes are about how can we make the most of the Gabba Stadium and connect people to the Gabba Stadium. So Mick de Brenny will also be a key player because of those dual responsibilities as Minister for Sport. And the other key pressure point at the moment, obviously, is our current state MP, Jackie Trad. And I would be making the argument that in the lead up to the coming state election, we need to be pressuring all the candidates, including Jackie, including Amy, including whoever else runs, to very clearly state what they support for this site. Because it's unlikely that the PDA, the development scheme, will be released prior to the state election. But going into the state election, it is necessary and appropriate and perfectly reasonable for the state candidates for this area and for each of the parties contesting the state election statewide to say what they think should happen on this site. And so we should be asking very specific questions. How many square meters of green space do you think there should be on the site? How many dwellings? How many public housing dwellings? How many private dwellings? We should be asking what community facilities will there be? Will there be a community theatre? Will there be a library? Will there be a public pool? Will there be sports fields and courts? All of those questions we should be posing, and we should be posing them quite specifically to all of those decision makers and to all the political parties, and demanding that they give us straight answers. So that's just a little bit. I'll talk a little bit more about political advocacy and where to next at the end, and how we can apply pressure and what steps we should take. But I'm going to start by going through some of the questions. The first one that was posted up was, can the PDA be reversed or overturned? Theoretically, it can. The state government could revoke the PDA declaration, or it could come up with a new one. Or, politically speaking, it's pretty unlikely at the moment, unless there's a massive shift in the political landscape. I would think strategically our best chance is to push for the development scheme that's introduced under the PDA to be one that really meets the community's needs. But yes, I think the PDA process itself is broken. It's so undemocratic. It is so exclusive of the community. But yeah, Amy, did you have anything to add to that? Or that was a fairly simple question, but you're all good? Cool. Next question was, in the PDA scheme for Queen's Wharf mentioned by Amy, the part on page 7 provides the vision loophole has no legislative reference. Is this PDA scheme document a legislative instrument in and of itself? If not, where is the legal justification? Amy, do you want to speak to that? Can you see that question?
Yeah, I'm not really an expert in this field. I know that the priority development areas fall under their own section of regulation that make reference to a planning instrument, which is the development scheme. So I'd say it will be in that piece of regulation how the development schemes are put together. But this also links to broader things that are broken in our planning process. This kind of loophole is already allowed under the Sustainable Planning Act, because we have a performance-based planning approach here in Queensland, where if developers are able to argue that their building meets the performance objectives for a particular site, they're able to get buildings that are higher and wider than what's set out in the neighbourhood plan. So we've got a much broader problem with planning here in Queensland, which is perfectly legal under the current legislation. But yeah, I agree, this is like a pretty glaring loophole that basically means the minister can look at any application and go, okay, well, it meets the broader vision, even if it contravenes elements of this scheme itself, which is a bit of a problem. And I think that section you find are replicated across most development schemes, priority development areas. But some of the other panelists might have a little bit more detail on this.
If any of the other panelists want to add anything to that, you're welcome to. Tessa? Or
I think that Peter Gardner has
Peter, did you want to share your knowledge on this, Peter?
Yes, thanks, John. I've worked for many years with the Southport PDA, and it was essentially, it was a good idea at the start because they generally use them to promote development in places where there hasn't been development. The only reason there hasn't been development on this site was because the government owned it and had buildings on it and were using it for decades. I remember when those buildings were built. So the use of a PDA on this is really an end run around the local planning scheme, and it's also avoiding the other alternative, which is elevation to state interest, which seems like a political move. So it really is a soft way of elevating it to state level without saying as much. But in fact, that process will all be about state agencies talking to each other and working out behind the scenes what goes on.
Good comment. The next little question was actually from Adrian to Tessa, and I think it's a good one. Adrian, did you just want to read that one out?
Sure. It's always been an interest of mine, closing streets. I think we have far too much space devoted to cars. I'm looking forward to driverless remote vehicles that can come and pick us up so that we have less use for streets. But it just struck me when I was looking at the density map that you were showing, Jono, and listening to Tessa about the need for green space in that whole area. Why couldn't, given the new access to public transport that the development provides, we actually take the opportunity to close down some streets and reclaim them as green space? You probably need a little bit of car parking here and there to accommodate those. But, I just think the streets that we have claim so much land in our cities that we ought to be able to reclaim some of them. So I'm just, because it's something I've thought about a lot over time, I just thought I'd take the opportunity to pose the question.
Yeah, Tessa, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, you're speaking my language. That's something that's often been discussed in within our professional sort of circles. The streets are public space, so already they are a part of your public space experience. Now, the quality of that will determine whether you use it. So it's a real big feeder into active travel, activated land, neighbourhoods, everything like that. But absolutely, so within this area, there is already, even without the increase in density and the reduction in car use, there is already an amazing opportunity to do what you've just said. So I might flick to screen because I was also thinking what you were thinking. So very, very quickly, going back to that land use plan that Jono has had a look at, I just wanted to very, very quickly point out that the green bits are park, the yellow bits are like state-owned, government-owned, special use, what have you. There is nothing in this area that even has the opportunity to be converted to public open space in the future. So I absolutely agree with you, Adrian. Even if we got the best case scenario, in my mind, obviously not everyone's, of getting a major park in that location, you still won't go far enough. So you do have to look at making those streets friendly, play streets, walkable streets. The perfect example is in here. So you've got some part pedestrianisation in the end of this Logan Road precinct. There is very little reason why you wouldn't extend that to here already, because the traffic is already lessened, because most of the traffic goes around up towards the Story Bridge that way, or down Balaclava and onto Ipswich Road. So that's the main conduit of traffic at the moment. So there is already opportunity to do that. Nile and, God, I can't remember the other street there, carry very little traffic. There is a bit of a way to get out of here. You've got to come through these streets to get back out towards the east. However, there's no reason why you can't make that a one-way system and cut off half of that trafficable area already. That's now. That's not saying there's less cars in the area. That is just now. But what I do want to take the opportunity to show you is, if by chance you got that as a green space, and if by chance you can actually pedestrianize to an extent, or increase the amenity or that scale of walkability through those passages, you all of a sudden have linked this across through here, up through here. A hell of a lot of work to make this happen. I've got to admit, there's a lot of level changes and challenges and barriers through here, but nothing's impossible. So in a dream world, you'd use every scrap of every opportunity, and it has got to include streets in the future. There is no way around that. So really? I hope that answers that.
No, that's a great image, Tessa, to sort of, there's so much potential here. And I love the idea of linking Norman Creek and Kingfisher Creek right through to the river. Another question that sort of touches on this that's popped up is the idea of converting Stanley Street and Vulture Street into two-way streets. And at the risk of broadening this conversation into a much bigger discussion about transport, there's a lot of literature around in terms of urban planning and transport planning that suggests that when you convert two-way streets into one-way, big, wide, one-way highways into two-way streets, you improve local connectivity and local flow. You also slow down the road environment. It can be easier to cross and move around. Because essentially what we have with this part of Woolloongabba, it's been carved up by big roads, Wellington Road, Stanley Street, Vulture Street, the motorway, etc. And the way those streets are designed at the moment prioritises high volumes of through traffic, but actually converting some of them back to two-way streets would improve the local connectivity, but would also make them much more friendly environments for pedestrians and bikes, and also public transport. Probably won't go into that too long, but it's really, really worth thinking a little bit more broadly, even in terms of what's the future for the motorway, and what do we think about where the off ramps are located and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, once you start allowing yourself to think big, there's no limit to where you stop. There were a few other questions floating around. Katrina, I think you were sort of asking, can we make a list of requirements and requests? I guess, were you sort of asking a list of all the things we want the site to include? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think for me, that's the whole point of what we need to be doing over the next few months, is that residents need to go into town, literally just list everything we want and demand all of it. There's no reason we can't ask for this stuff, because it is public land. And it's up to all of us who are starting to get educated about this site and to form opinions, to be talking to our neighbours and saying, what do you think should happen on the site? What do you think our community needs? And we don't just have to produce one list that we all agree on. We should all be producing lists and merge that into one giant list down the track. Because this is such a big site. This is 5 hectares. It's huge. And so we don't even have to be choosing between, do we want a basketball court or do we want a public swimming pool? We can have both. I want the skate park. I want the theatre. I want all of it. And there's no reason we shouldn't demand all of it. But what's really important is that we raise more awareness about this site, because most people don't even know this development's happening. They drive past along Stanley Street or Vulture Street every day. They see a big construction site. They see something about Cross River Rail and they think the whole thing is just a train station. They don't understand how much land is left over and how much potential there is above ground. And so essentially part of this whole forum is to inspire and recruit you to be more active and vocal about the future of this site, because this isn't just about Woolloongabba or Kangaroo Point or East Brisbane. This is one of the biggest redevelopments in inner Brisbane and in my lifetime. And if we get this wrong, we will miss so many amazing opportunities to get more green space, more community facilities, more public housing, better transport connectivity. We could get all of that, but to do so, we need to mobilise not just dozens, but hundreds, if not thousands of people to be putting pressure, particularly on the Queensland Labor government, particularly on the state MPs and state candidates, but also on just the general public to be more excited about this site and recognise that the land we're talking about, it's almost as big as the public part of South Bank. this is huge. And I think once you start recognizing that it's so rare to have a public site like this, the opportunities just balloon. But a few other points I wanted to add, and just to draw people's attention to. Tessa mentioned this, that the council is currently out to consultation on Woolloongabba precinct strategy, and I have to say it's pretty funny because no one even knows they're out to consultation on it. They do such a poor job of promoting this stuff. But I've shared my screen, and you might be able to see they've released Boggo Road and Woolloongabba precinct renewal strategies. They've released a strategy for each of the major train stations. And I think this is partly a political move by council to try and exert a bit more influence over the state government, because I know, talking to council people inside, even they aren't happy with the sort of visualizations the state government's proposing. Even the council's not happy about losing Woolloongabba Place Park and turning that into a high rise. But I encourage you to have a jump on the council website. I'll share the link in the chat or post it by email later. This precinct renewal strategy, sort of essentially what this document does, it says, oh, well, here's what happens within the site. That's up to the state government. But here's what we think should happen around it. And it talks about connectivity through the Logan Road precinct and what's happening on all the land around the site. And I think it would be really valuable for residents and local community groups and other stakeholders to put in a submission into this Woolloongabba precinct renewal strategy consultation. It doesn't have to be a detailed submission. It can literally be a 5-sentence email where you just send a quick email to council and say, feedback on the Woolloongabba precinct renewal strategy. I think we need whatever, more public green space, better connectivity from Logan Road through to the station site. List all the things you want to see. And that way they're on council's list as well. And once you've come up with that list, you can add that into future, you might be making future submissions on the Cross River Rail site itself. So you're not doubling up, you're not doing more work. You might as well take this opportunity of the council consultation to just sketch out what you think should happen for the future of the site itself and also for the surrounding precinct, and flood the council with feedback that the council will then have to show to the state government as well. But this could be a good exercise, because often people are like, well, I care about this site, but the state government's not out for public consultation yet, and the state government hasn't announced anything clear yet, so what can I actually do right now? Right now, in practical terms, you can make a submission to this council precinct renewal strategy, CC in my ward office so that I have a copy of it as well. And you might as well CC in the state MP, Jackie Trad, and anyone else you want, so that they know that residents are starting to get active and starting to mobilise on this stuff. I've been rambling on a little bit now, but if anyone had any other questions, feel free to post them up in the chat, because we've still got a few minutes left. Otherwise, I'll talk a little bit more about options for advocacy. Someone's just asked, does a good old petition work? I tend towards the view that on projects like this, mass individual letters are better than, like, even as an elected representative, if I get a petition from 20 people, I'm like, okay, 1 or 2 people were really motivated to start the petition and a whole bunch of other people just put their name down. That's how elected representatives often interpret petitions. But if I, as an elected representative, get 20 emails, and it's not a template email where everyone's just copy pasted the same thing, but 20 residents have all taken the time to write their own thoughts, that has a lot more input. So if at some point a petition seems worthwhile, I'll probably start one and let people know. But I think at this stage, the best thing is for people to be sending individual emails and to be CCing all the decision makers and to CC me so I have a copy. Gail has kindly posted up in the chat some of the email addresses for the ministers, Kate Jones and Mick de Brenny. Gail, if you'd be kind enough to copy them again and paste them right at the bottom of the chat thread, that would be helpful. Kate Jones, Mick de Brenny, Jackie Trad are all key people we should be pushing. But it also doesn't hurt to be writing to the LNP leader, Deb Frecklington, or whoever their shadow spokesperson is on development stuff, and ask them what their position is, because we'd like to get it to a point where in the lead up to the election, all the parties are articulating publicly what they want for this site and that they feel pressure to declare where they stand, because right now they're not experiencing that pressure. This is still feeling like quite a local issue, but actually it's not a local issue. This is a citywide issue, and we need to treat it as such and force the political representatives to treat it as a citywide issue. There's a few other pathways that you can get involved though at the moment. The first is that we've started a little Facebook group for those of you who use Facebook. It's called let me just read it's called the Gabba and Bogga Road Stations Community Vision Group. I'll post a link to that group in the chat as well. Oh, thanks, Gail, you beat me to it. So if you use Facebook, you can join that group, and that's a really good space to start discussions about what you think should happen on the site. So people like Katrina was before, what's our list of requests? Post up in that group and say, this is what I think we need, and ask other people what they think they need. I just saw that Adrian's got to leave. Thank you again, Adrian, for your time. I really appreciate your contribution. Everyone just give Adrian a wave and a thank you. Cheers, mate. We'll talk to you soon. Have a good one. So yeah, please jump into that Facebook group. The other thing, if you're not already on my email newsletters, subscribe to updates. It's just jonathans.com/updates. That's another way just to keep in the loop about further events and actions we're organising. As the shutdown eases and it becomes okay to hold big public meetings, we'll definitely be doing actions on site and further public meetings and events. I think in particular, we need to push back really strongly against the idea of losing Woolloongabba Place Park. Maybe there's a question of how it could be repurposed, but we shouldn't accept a situation where they take away one park and then give us another park and say, job done. So we might even hold a community barbecue or festival or event down in Woolloongabba Place Park. But I, as the councillor, don't have capacity to organise all of that stuff. Part of it's going to have to come from the community. It's going to have to come from you guys, putting your hands up to talk to your neighbours, to organise events, to maybe even hold discussion groups like this within your own community networks if you belong to a PNC or a neighbourhood watch or some other local community group. Just get them talking about this. So one question is, can I put together a letter with a call to action you can hand deliver on? Thank you so much for that offer. Yeah, we'll take you up on that. We've actually also already recruited 1 or 2 residents who are willing to make phone calls, because we have a few hundred phone numbers of residents who live in my electorate, and I don't have time to call them all. But I think this issue is important enough that we should actually be calling up strangers and saying, have you heard about this station? Can you do something about it? So if people feel like delivering flyers or feel like making phone calls, let us know. If I don't get back to you, just shoot my office an email and we'll follow up. But we're basically trying to recruit volunteers who can be actively involved in this campaign and can push the state government in the lead up to the election. It's going to be a non-partisan, non-party lines campaign. It's not a Greens thing. It's me as the local councillor supporting the local community to articulate what residents want. And I think that's going to be really important. So yeah, if you don't use Facebook, just shoot me an email and we'll keep you in the loop. But we do hope to hold a few more discussions like this in the future. I'm mindful of time, and we said we'd finish at 7:30. Amy or Tessa, did you have any final comments that you wanted to share with people?
No, just to thank you for the opportunity, and that it is good that people are mindful that that they can have an impact on articulating what they want, but that doesn't have to necessarily be all the same thing either. I feel like it's the state government and the PDA authority or Cross River Rail's authority to actually investigate what we want enough that that a balanced development is seen at this site. Thank you.
Thanks, Tessa. Amy, any last comments?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I guess just to say it's so good to see that there's a lot of enthusiasm and interest in this site, and a lot of good ideas coming through on the chat and from Tessa and Adrian for what we could have on this site. And I think for us as a community, we really can't let this opportunity go past us again. We've seen too much bad overdevelopment go on across our neighbourhood, from West End to Woolloongabba. We've seen so many incredible sites that are now just filled with poorly designed high-rises, and we really can't let that happen again in the heart of the Gabba, where we have this incredible bit of land, publicly owned land, that we could use to do something really exciting and useful for the community. So I'd encourage everyone to take all your energy from tonight and be getting in touch with Jono and everyone else that he's mentioned to put forward some of your ideas. And over the next few months, I'll also be doing a little bit of work around this to be gathering people's ideas and be putting forward a bit of a vision as we lead up to the state election. So thanks, everyone.
Well said, Amy. Thank you. And we should have email addresses for everyone who's in this call because you're all registered. So we will send a follow-up email that will have a lot of those links, including the links to the Wollongabba precinct strategy and how to make a submission on that. So keep an eye out for that email in the next couple of days. That's possible we won't get it out till Monday. But thank you all so much for participating. I really appreciate Tessa and Amy for making time for this in particular. And I'm just, really excited to think about the potential of something amazing on this side. Let's not allow ourselves to be narrow-minded and unambitious. Let's think big and let's be optimistic and push for something amazing, because you think back to what happened with South Bank, where 30 years ago, property developers just wanted to turn all of South Bank into high-rise development, and the community pushed back and said, we want public parkland instead. And that South Bank site speaks for itself now. It's an amazing destination for the entire city. And why shouldn't we push for something similar on a site like this? So thanks again, everyone. I'll stick around for a few more minutes if anyone wants to just have a longer conversation with me or talk about any other issues. We'll stop the recording now as well so that, we can end the recorded discussion.